So, bottom line then for these individuals at that decision point, once again, is that they that there's a sense of hopelessness, and there's also probably a high level of anger.
To hear them describe it, there is almost no hope. They're third generation, in each case, third generation refugee camp residents. So if they just stretch that out, they can see their children living in the same squalid refugee camp, absent either a struggle of some sort, a struggle that gets a settlement. Well, their family's going to live in there, and their children's children will live in the refugee camp. So the notion of hope was just completely absent from that.
And people need that.
And you have to have some sort of hope, or you are going to fight. You know, you'll fight somewhere. The conditions in the camp were not great by any stretch. They're just mess of kids running around with very little in very tightly, densely packed quarters, and it would be hard to live in those conditions.
You have studied hundreds of different civil wars throughout, say, the last decade or more?
Last 50 years or so.
50 years, okay.
End of World War II.
Is this typical? In what ways is it atypical?
Right. Many people, maybe most people, wouldn't really call the Israeli-Palestinian struggle a civil war. So in that sense, it's very atypical. Most, even the Palestinians, say, oh, don't call this a civil war, because that means Palestinians are fighting Palestinians. So in that sense, it's quite atypical. But the root, if you strip away who's whom in this thing, it looks a lot like a civil war to me. A lot of people would call this an anti-colonial war. It's much more like an occupying power occupying a territory, and then the people of that territory are fighting to expel the occupier. Maybe a little bit like Iraq today, but certainly like most of Africa in the 50s, 60s, 70s. So there's some theme of that. Where it's similar, frankly, is people who are deprived on any number of dimensions, oftentimes political dimensions, certainly economic dimensions, quite often social dimensions. So the people who are resisting are the poorest. They're shut out of the political system. They're not allowed to practice their language or religion or something of that nature.
And so in terms of that risk, they've got little to lose. So they might lose, but it's not, what have they got to lose?
Only what they have to lose is life. So even people who live in desperately poor environments love their family, love life. And that happens all over the world, frankly. Not all of them choose to fight to change that condition. So there's some other step that's required. Many, many more people live in desperately poor conditions where they're cut out of politics, cut out of any economic hope, and they never fight for it. That's one of the interesting puzzles about why civil wars. Why do maybe the people from our inner cities or the people in India, the untouchables in India, why don't they rise up? You know, there's tens of millions of them, but they don't. They endure their impoverished life with some sort of dignity, but at the core, they still have that human dignity.
So what is that little bit that pushes them over?
Well, you know, that's the most interesting. If you had that, you'd have the Rosetta Stone for understanding civil wars. Some of it is leadership, I think. If I'm going to ask you to take a lot of risk, and that risk is your family, your job, your house, probably your life, but if it's not your life, you might be tortured and imprisoned for a long time. You live at the end of it, but you don't like that life. I gotta be convincing to you. Martin Luther King convinced a lot of African Americans to take risks at the time of lynchings and beatings and all that.
Yep.
Mahatma Gandhi, Jesus Christ, Nelson Mandela. These are big name folks, and they're also big name changes. But at the core, even a greedy organizer or leader needs some fodder to go fight. And where do you pull from? Well, you pull from the poor and the downtrodden and the dispossessed, which in many ways mirrors the Palestinians. I rode on these little buses going through the Israeli checkpoints with a lot of students going to the campus. You know, and the Israelis come up and they harass them for what would seem to us to be no purpose. Now, if you ask the Israelis, they'd have a purpose, and their purpose would be that we're trying to find those guys that you're going to meet next week. You know, that the armed guys have to get through the same Israeli checkpoints somehow. So they'll slip in on a bus maybe. And the checkpoints are in part a mechanism to catch the guys that I wanted to meet. But on the little buses I were on were mostly students. And they would be harassed, as was I, frankly, as part of the process. That is humiliating, and it's anger-inducing.
So, Pat, with this firsthand knowledge, but then also the academic knowledge from over the years, if you were hired by the UN to consult on UN intervention in civil wars, what would you say to them?
I would say you have to find the conditions for a negotiated outcome. You have to find...
so don't squash them.
Most civil wars end in a squash. If I were hired by the leader of a government, I might say squash them. A government facing a rebellion, I might say squash them. Frankly, from an empirical perspective, not a humanist perspective, the easiest way is to cut it off before it gets started. The Israelis are great at this. If you can defeat a small rebel movement right at the beginning, you know, do it. Do it. Now I sound like I'm advising governments to go out and slaughter people. I don't mean it in that way. If the long-term costs of a civil war are more than the short-term costs of just being brutal, well, then maybe brutal work. Che Guevara, one of the icons of revolutionary movements, was hunted down like a dog and shot with a band of a dozen or something like that. From an anti-revolutionary movement, that was a great strategy. Anti-insurgency movements, if they're effective, boy, you know, they cut off the legs of a civil war and it's fine. From a UN point of view, that's kind of after you get the civil war. Once you have a large enough rebel movement that can press the government. Darfur is one of these. I think the evidence would bear out that you have to engage the two sides in negotiation. They're fighting over something that's most of the time tangible. It's distribution of this or distribution of that. And those are things that we know how to negotiate. The fact of the matter is we do it when we're buying a car or a washing machine or a house. It's not that much different in principle if you're fighting over oil revenues, which is what...
Or land.
Or land, or water rights, or anything like that. They're divisible goods, but the two sides are locked in a battle that takes on, in some ways, an energy of its own. So it's hard for them to say, okay, I'll negotiate over that land with just you. We don't need an outside person, because the minute I do that, I'm betraying I'm a little bit weak. Right? So it's nearly impossible for me to betray my weakness and still have a hope of fighting you or having hope of winning something at the negotiation table. So quite often, they won't negotiate because neither side can broach that that initial concession. So I would tell the UN, get in there with some folks and look at the concessions that can be made. Look at the grievances of the rebels. These folks don't take risks unless some conditions gravitate towards taking those risks, just like you and I don't. And just like the Palestinians in the refugee camps will take the risk, but the ones at the universities won't take the risks because there's not a grievance there that would really allow them to do that. And then I think you have to entice, the UN would have to entice demobilization of the soldiers. You got to get the guns out of their hands, and you got to get jobs for the ex-soldiers. Right. If you can get them to demobilize, it's one thing, but if they've been fighting a war long enough, the young men mostly know about fighting wars, and it's been their revenue stream. Fighting wars has been their revenue stream. So to demobilize them, you make them unemployed. Well, we fought because we were unemployed. Or maybe your older brother started fighting because he was unemployed and you got swept into it. But there has to be some hope that's in there.